In this podcast, we will explore some of the leadership paradoxes that emerge from the fact that nowadays leaders are asked to navigate a world that is facing significant and increasingly urgent challenges. In a digital and complex world with global megatrends such as the speed and scale of technological development and the imbalance of age and demographics, the need for leadership that is fit for the task has increased. To succeed, leaders need new skills and characteristics that ultimately require the ability to possess seemingly opposite sets of capabilities. COVID-19 has accelerated the importance of these characteristics, those paradoxes of leadership, as we call them. This podcast elaborates on these and connects them to this year's results of PwC's CEO survey and Hopes and Fears survey, taking into account the views of thousands chief executives and almost 33,000 members of the general public worldwide. Listen to Debby Jannink, partner in the People and Organization practice of PwC in the Netherlands, Anja Sbanski, global lead of the PwC Center of Excellence for Leadership and partner in the German People and Organization practice, and Blair Sheppard, PwC's global strategy head and author of the book 10 Years to Midnight.
Hi Debby, hi Blair. I very much look forward to spending the next hour together with you, talking about the latest survey results that we just heard within the CEO survey and the Hopes and Fears survey, but also what the world that is evolving around us, that has been evolving around us for the past year with the pandemic, what kind of challenges that is putting in front of leaders these days. And so great to have you here. Thank you so much. One term that we always keep hearing about leadership in the future is the paradoxical mindset of leaders that we need to evolve to. We work at PwC, we work with the 6 paradoxes of leadership as a mindset framework for leaders. And Blair, I know that you're the brain behind that framework. Can you elaborate a bit on where you were coming from and how that evolved for us?
Yeah, it was actually a team project. So you know, I'm the face in front of a lot of work by a team. It actually began with not focus on leadership. We were trying to understand the forces acting on the world so we could build our own strategy inside PwC. And we went around the world and interviewed people in government, civil society, business, just on the street, and asked them what they were worried about. And the same 5 things came up again and again and again and again. They were the same 5 worries. We coined the phrase adapt to describe them. So really quickly, it was sort of a growing disparity in the world, asymmetry, the disruptive impact of climate and technology on our lives, the ways in which age made that worse in different ways around the world. So in Nigeria, it would be educational needs and needs for work, or in Northern Europe would be the impact of people retiring. The growing polarization in the world, and as a consequence, declining trust in institutions, right? And so as we looked at those issues and studied them and looked at the people who are doing a good job of addressing them, we saw that they had a pattern of capabilities that was different from what I had been doing, developing leaders my entire life, right? And so we looked at people who were good in each of those cases and discovered sort of 6 dilemmas or paradoxes, apparent paradoxes they had to resolve. And that became a framework that we developed and applied it back, and it worked really well. We've used it internally, and it's been pretty powerful, actually. Mm.
Well, strategic executor is one of those paradoxes that we were talking about, which came very apparent for a lot of organizations, a lot of clients that we work with, especially in the past year. You know, how do you act strategically in a world that is changing constantly? How do you execute in that insecurity? Debby, you had a lot of those conversations as well in the past, right, on a lot of the paradoxes.
Yeah, so and to name a few, I mean, I think certainly in this pandemic, the humble hero, which will speak to quite some people. But if you look at how the pandemic was approached by different world leaders, you would see those, right? So both sides of those coins. So whether you do it heroically or humbly, and probably the best way was to do it in a combination of them. But I think as well, what we've very much been confronted with over the past year is the tech-savvy humanist as a paradox, where we had to be very tech-savvy in, like we're doing this, right, currently, in a tech-savvy way, yet talking about things that really do matter, talking about emotions, trying to get to the undercurrents, so staying human beings with emotions and stuff, and so forth. So we have, I mean, we'll get to all of them, I guess, but I think they're so right to the spot of where we're at currently and where our leaders currently are dealing with.
And especially with all those lockdowns around the world, I think for everybody who was used to, working abroad, traveling, having a team in different countries, visiting them, working with them in person, they were facing the globally minded localists. So how do you lead a team that is scattered around the globe when you feel like you're locked down in your country, right? And the current environment becomes even more present to everybody. Yeah.
So Anja, let's pick that one up because I think it's important and it sets up where we're going to go, I think, right? So one of these issues, and let me take my own job, right? A part of my job is to do strategy for the network, which means I have to understand how the world is working. It's really hard to be seated in a single office all the time and really come to terms with where the world is, because there's this narrowing lens, there's this kind of localizing lens. And so you actually have to develop disciplines and practices and ways of actually getting to know the world, or you're trapped, right? And so we've been presented a host of new challenges that are pretty interesting, but tough to do. And the tendency would be to sort of orient toward one of them. So I'll use technology to get lots of people, but I forget the impact I'm having on people, and I'll forget I need to empathize better. Right? And you can just think about all the paradoxes that way, that we've been driven in one way, and we actually have to be better at balancing what we do.
And maybe if I can chip in this one, because I had a conversation a few weeks ago with one of my clients, a leader, and he said, it's funny because I think that the way we're currently sort of working together, it has a lot to do with theater. And I think I mentioned it to you already, Blair, earlier, where on a movie, etc., you would be able to script it more and you would be more prepared, etc. But on the theater, you have to do everything sort of to expand everything you do. But it has also something more real, because we're actually, like we're looking now. I mean, Blair, we're in your working room at home. I have this is not home, by the way, but I would wish, but a beautiful background. So you have, and there's a story behind every background in every setting that everybody's in. So that also has, I mean, there's the contradiction in it already, right?
Exactly. You in a sense, I don't see you face to face over dinner and a glass of wine, but you do see my son and my father in the background, right? And so it provides you with so what about them, right? And you'll hear the dog, and you'll see my wife walk through, and so the personal elements of life are more revealed than ever. But the kind of human exchange that you have that happens face to face is lost, and so we have to replace one with the other and learn how to adapt to that, which is kind of a fun challenge, actually, right?
And speaking of adaptation, I guess we all know what it means to innovate within the past year, being it your private life, being it at work, different ways of working. So how much tradition can we still keep in times like these? And how can we make sure we innovate as an organization, as a person in our personal environment, right? So I feel that there's a lot of those paradoxes in our everyday job, in our everyday world. But how can we manage that as leaders? How can one person get that right? Is it possible that one person gets that right, navigating all of those paradoxes?
It's a really good question. I hope we spend more time on in the conversation on it. So let me pick up on your point about tradition and innovation. One of the things that a lot of people have discovered as they've engaged life in a more cloistered world is that actually the relationships that matter to the most of them, to them most, are the ones they're actually focused on. Right. So they're recentering on their core so they can be expansive in what they do electronically. And so there's a paradox in that, right? So it turns out, I think I've visited in this last 6 months, 82 countries, which I never would have done in my previous role. But actually, I've had fewer and fewer close relationships than I had before, because it's the ones that really matter I'm keeping, right? and I'm not allowed to extend beyond those, even if I wanted to, right? So there's this dilemma, there's this paradox of greater intimacy and greater expansiveness at the same time. How do we become authentic selves in that world is a really interesting topic.
So how do we?
So Debbie, do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll jump in.
Well, I wanted first to pick up on what you were asking earlier, Anja, on the can you do that on your own, right? How can you? I mean, we're not superheroes. Well, some of us maybe are, but certainly not everybody, not at least all of the leaders we need, I think, nowadays. So it's all a matter of diversity, teaming, being together, bringing in different lenses and different perspectives. And I think that's also one of the things that we saw in the latest CEO surveys, that diversity and certainly inclusion then, because you can have a different voice, but then you need to be heard, right? But bringing that in is such crucially important in order to navigate the world that's ahead of us in the world that we're in.
I mean, there's a really important point in that, I think, if I can pick up on it, which is we have to be really self-aware on each of these paradoxes where we're weak. And that's hard because essentially we're good at something because we like it and we care about it and we're interested in it, right? And so we don't pay attention to the thing we're not good at. And so the irony is we actually have to really understand what we don't understand well naturally. And we actually have to appreciate in someone else the thing that we don't really like naturally and value that, right? Because if we don't, we're not going to have the complementarity that allows us to fulfill all the needs we have. And so it changes the meaning of diversity, because in some ways, part of what the way we think about in diversity is how we help the other, right? In this case, it's how do I actually achieve the things I'm trying to achieve by complementing myself with the things I'm not strong at, right? And so it highlights that there's both a selflessness and a selfishness in this notion of diversity and inclusion. And so if you're not persuaded you need to do it for societal reasons or selfless reasons, you need to do it because if you don't, you're not going to survive as a leader.
And there's the humble hero already right around the corner, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Because if you don't admit what you're weak at and you don't have humility, you won't act. But if you don't have the courage to bring someone in and use them and respect them for what they are, you won't achieve what you want to. So it's a brilliant use of humble hero, actually, Debbie.
And it's also a question of your personal background, your company's culture, of how much you were used to admitting your development areas and on how much you were used to talking about your strengths only as a leader. So I see that as a topic that leaders really are challenged with right now.
So Anja, if you think about in the role you've had in developing people, right, in your career, one of the things you did and I did and we all did was we told people build the strength. And part of that was actually you want people to be proud of who they are. You want them to sort of go into a room confidently. You want them to feel like they belong in a way, right? That they deserve a seat at the table. Part of what we're saying now is that's an important thing, but it's not enough. You actually have to mitigate weakness, right? I use this analogy. I probably need to find a non-sports analogy, but there's a book out that asks the question, why is Roger Federer such a great tennis player, right? And the answer is he's weak at nothing. He has a great backhand. He has a great forehand. He can play at the net. He can play a lob game. He can spin. He can serve. And so you can't play to his weakness. And many of his sort of competitors had one thing: a brilliant serve or a brilliant backhand. And eventually they wore down. He could play to where they weren't. And eventually, when in the world, because it's coming so fast and it's so interdependent, and it's so complex. And the expectations are so high, your weakness will reveal themselves really quickly if you don't somehow navigate that. Mm.
So when we come from the more standard view on leadership and leadership development, we look at development areas, we want to develop them. The question here to me really is, can my mindset navigating those paradoxes really be developed? So can I, for myself, also balance my weak areas, or do I definitely need other people to do that? Is there no way for me to work on my mindset?
So I think, let me start then, Debbie, you have a perspective I think is important on this one. So a couple of things. The first is it's worth actually doing what got us to the paradoxes in the first place, which is what are the challenges I'm grappling with as a leader? And we highlight some of those in the survey we're about to talk about, right? What are the challenges I'm grappling with as a leader? And what does that require of me? And what you'll see is it's going to require you to be good at things that feel mutually contradictory, right? You then have to be sufficiently self-aware that you know where you're not strong. Then the question becomes, how do I develop it, right? And a couple of things about that. One of them is use your strength to build your weakness. So if you're a nerd and you really love technology, use technology to learn how to become a human being, right? And understand human systems. And so if you're really good at people, work with people to learn to be a technologist, right? So use your strength to build. And I think the other one is, back to Debbie's point, if you have a diverse team because you need it, because you don't have all the things, really respect and study and appreciate the person who is where you're not strong. Because even if you're not good at it, you have to know how to use it. And so you gotta be good enough. So Debbie, any thoughts on that one?
Well, I would like to concur to what you ended up with, because I think that is really that's crucial in moving ahead. And I'd like to bring the word of compassion in there, because I think it's being open and non-judgmental about people thinking, seeing, voicing things differently. That is really going to make the change that is needed, or at least was going to make the ball rolling. So I think you have to have that open mindset in order to be able to do that in a proper way. So compassion is something that I think is not per se something that we've used a lot in leadership development so far, but loving compassion is, I think, something that's going to be very, very relevant.
Yeah. This is going to sound odd, but actually you're describing the ways in which we need to be political and a high integrity politician, right? So in a sense, because the world is interdependent, because the world is complicated, you actually need to understand people on their terms and feel what people are feeling, right? Which is at the heart of empathy and compassion. Because if you don't, you'll never find the solution that works for everybody, right? That the old way of kind of log rolling or trading off in the back room, it's a different kind of politics that's required. We still need to persuade and create coalitions and negotiate, but it has to come from a better understanding of the other. And because of that, it actually allows us to retain our integrity in the process, right? The other versions of politics wouldn't, right? And so I think there are some themes like self-awareness and compassion and empathy that will cut across every one of the paradoxes if you're going to deliver them well. But I think maybe, Anja, it's worth getting to sort of some of the things we're hearing from the survey to make this come to life for people, because it probably feels kind of abstract right now.
Yeah, you mentioned technology and the advance of technology. So we are in the middle of an accelerated digital transformation that everybody feels every day. While CEOs in the survey mentioned that they would invest heavily in the next year into technology and digital transformation, in the hopes and fears survey, we see that a lot of employees actually are afraid of that advancement because they're afraid to lose their jobs, afraid what it does to their workplace. How do you see that?
So I think it's a really important point that they're raising in hopes and fears, right? You could think of it as the stranded human asset problem, right? So here's the analogy. The example that comes to mind for me is, imagine you're in oil and gas and you're a PhD geologist. Sometime in the very near future, we're going to need far, far fewer of them. They're hugely well-trained. They're hugely smart. They were hugely valuable to the economy as it was. But if we don't figure out how to repurpose them, retool them, help them grow into another job and transfer to something else, they're a massively valuable asset that's stranded in the world. Because of the fast pace of technology and the disruptions of business, the number of those people is going to grow. And actually, a lot of them are going to be people mid-career with debt, kids in school, and it's going to be expensive that they have to make that transition. So I know why they're scared. Our own data sort of says that in some countries in the world, 40% of work is going to turn over in the next decade, and others will be 25%. That's a lot of work. And it isn't that there isn't something on the backside, but it requires new skills. So if a company doesn't invest in those skills ahead of the demand, then the people, they're going to have to replace them with people who have them in the marketplace. And we're going to have all these people sitting there that are stranded and society's going to have to figure out how to deal with that. And they're going to be really valuable people we leave stranded. So I think it's a really important survey item to be focused on.
Yeah. So maybe a question or an observation is, I'm an optimistic person, right? So I see an opportunity in that as well, because I think that lots of people, I mean, if you call them engineers or whatever, that might, their job might become obsolete. But I think most human beings, they have this tick, not because per se on the content of what they do, but the way they contribute, the feeling it gives them, the fulfilling that they have to either bring that to a different generation or whatsoever. And I think tapping into that is going to make those persons maybe even the leaders of the future, because that's exactly what we need, right? So
Exactly.
yeah.
So now you've just made kind of a tech-savvy humanist argument. Let me make that come to life if I can, right, Debbie? Which is the example, the issue you described, Anja, is a perfect example of why we need to understand people and human systems while we're building out technology, right? So if you are a person who really just gets tech, and you know how you have to change your company to compete in the world, and you're driving a technology change, there's all of these consequences that will occur that you don't think about because you're not sufficiently humanly aware, right? And so you end up creating the dilemma that Debbie doesn't want us to have, right? But if you actually understand human systems and human nature, you'll anticipate that and you'll bake it into your strategy and your execution as you do it, right? Now let's flip it to the other side. Let's imagine you're the HR person who really gets the human side, or you're a general manager who really gets the human side, but you don't understand technology. The problem is that you become increasingly irrelevant and you lose a seat at the table. So your voice matters, but it won't be heard because you can't do the thing we need you to do on the tech side. So we need people who can actually balance those two perspectives. And we need the person who studied sociology and psychology and human resources in school to actually become technically really savvy and capable to understand what it means for business. And we need the person who studied engineering in school to actually get to know how people think and how human systems work. Because if we don't, there's going to be a mismatch, and the optimism Debbie has won't come. So it comes back to, we need leaders who can put those two things together to create the world she wants versus the dark world employees are worried about.
Yeah, we need the leaders and also the processes for it, right? Whenever we think a system, we also need in parallel think the human being in the organization, which is not necessarily embedded right now. Yeah, very true. If we stay a bit with that innovation, the new ways of working, the hybrid environments that we see also, like we are now meeting virtually, everybody in a different place, right? What kind of new challenges do you see or have evolved already and will be evolving even further when you look at leadership in that hybrid environments?
So let's do the challenge of the environment, right, and then the leadership challenge. So I think one thing I want to highlight is when COVID slows down in countries, as it will eventually, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rethink the optimal combination of people, computers, and technology. I mean, people, computers, and real estate, right? And because we built a system that was designed in a notion, everyone goes into an office, everyone goes into a workplace, everyone goes into a store to do their business, to do their work, right? And what we need to do is say, actually, you don't have to. In some cases you do, in others you don't. And so what's the right pairing? What's the right combination, right? And so the intellectual problem is that. The leadership problem is actually a couple of things. First one is the technology in our present form drives us to be increasingly local, right? We understand the milieu we're in, but actually the world has a lot of interdependencies that have gotten even harder. And so how do we navigate understanding the world from a point where the technology is driving us to be increasingly internal and parochial and closed in terms of the relationships we have, right? So it's a classic example of globally minded localists. Mm-hmm. And I think the other piece that's dangerous in this that we have to worry about is we can lose the thing that makes our business special. We can lose whatever the relationships are or the culture is or the other pieces that make our business special. And we can feel really good about all the innovation we achieve, but then we get to the other side and say, who are we? Right. And so there's this element of tradition innovator in that question as well. That's really, really important. So Debbie, you were talking about this before we got on the call. So what do you think about this issue of the world we're now talking to each other over and what that means for the challenges of leadership?
I'm still thinking about it, because I think you're never done on pondering about this. But I think one of the things that is definitely very apparent is that you need to be you need to not navigate maybe, but be in so many different perspectives and thinking and belief models at the same time, that's what makes it hard, right? That's where you get to the globally minded localist, where you're a strategist, but an executor. You have to be traditional, so honor the legacy and everything that's been functional and brought you where you are, yet innovate on a different skill than you've been used to. So what I see with some of our clients is that they are exactly, that's why I really like the concept of the paradox, is it nails really where they're struggling with. And certainly in this time where you need to be remote yet very present, and you need to be all of what we just discussed about.
And one of the interesting things is you have to flip the switch really fast, right? So I was describing to you before the call the number of presentations. So I did this one with the World Humanitarian Forum, and then a bunch of asset managers on the West Coast, and then a talent group that was global, and then a very, very local group in Japan, right? And so what happens is you have to be able to flip the switch across these dimensions that are really, really important, because the paradox that mattered to the humanitarian forum is very different from one that mattered to the asset managers. It's very different from the ones who were worried about what do we do about Japan and the Olympics, right? And so you have to be able to move much more nimbly across things where you would have had time to make the migration. You'd have walked from an office to another location, grab a cup of coffee, you'd have gotten on a plane, whatever it is, you would have had a chance to settle down and move to the next one. They just come rapidly now in a way that makes it really interesting.
You mentioned one very interesting aspect, Blair, when you talked about the culture, the company culture, and what it does to us to work remotely. And Debbie, I know that with the practice you're leading in the Netherlands, there's a lot of projects around culture, or have been there for the past years. What change do you see when we look at culture and the focus in a very hybrid environment?
So I see, one of the things I see is that there's even more effort, attention, involvement being put into it, because I think everybody's aware, and you see that in the survey as well, right, that it is something that you really need to grasp in order to be able to grow. And I don't mean per se financial growth. What I see a lot of companies doing, and I think that's where you were referring to earlier, Blair, as well, is that it's also growing in meaning and purpose as an organization. You see that we've been, certainly through this pandemic, so much confronted with what's the meaning of things, what have we done, what can we learn from that. So I see the whole concept of purpose and building a culture that is true to who you are, what you can bring as an organization, whether it's products that you develop, whether it's services that you give, or whether it is a societal, more governmental body. But I think all of them I see, and you're right, Anja, we've had already quite some work being done in that field here in the area, and it's growing intensively because of that, in my opinion.
Which is interesting when you look at the survey results, because the survey results rather see a slight decline in investments in culture projects. But actually what we're seeing in the market is the opposite, right?
I do think there's an interesting thing here, which is part of what's happened in COVID is we focused on the practicalities of getting things done, right? We focused on execution in a way, because the executional challenges are huge, even for the companies that are successful. So, if I'm a company that's successful and I have to hire 250,000 people around the world, That's as big a problem as I have to repair my balance sheet if I'm in trouble, because they're all reset repair problems, right, in a sense, and they're very executional. The danger is you get focused on that and you miss how fast the big trends are coming at you, right? So in the world that we lived in, you could have a job like mine, right, which is the strategist goes to the mountain, talks to a lot of people, and comes down with the tablets. It doesn't work that way anymore. You actually have to strategize for execution, but you also have to bring the future into your execution. So I think, and we see this in an interesting way where climate actually isn't as significant on people's minds as actually it should be. And even from the survey to now, it's massively come on. So two things about that, I think, Anja. First is you cannot segment any longer and say, I'm just gonna do the administrative task and I'm gonna move to doing the forward-looking task. You got to put them together. So strategy and execution cohabit. Right? The second point is, in a world as uncertain as ours, and in a world as dynamic as ours, you have to kind of go back and say, what's at the core of who we are? So you can preserve that as you adapt. Because if you break everything, we've seen what happens to organizations that break everything. Right? And so you have to preserve. And I think what that gets you to are the kinds of questions Debbie went to, which is, what are your values? What's your purpose? And what do you believe in profoundly? Now, know that, and what makes you special as a company? Know that, preserve that, and then change everything else, right? And then as I change, I know there's ballast, there's a keel, there's an anchor, there's something that I can come back to, and it creates coherence in all the change.
And actually, maybe to add to that, because so you're right, in the survey you see a slight decrease, but there's a huge increase on health and well-being, right? And I think that's a different lens to that same topic or that same theme, where you look at, when does your workforce feel at ease? How can I make them as productive, as intrinsically motivated as possible? And so we translated, certainly in this, I guess, era, as health and well-being, which I totally, I'm absolutely on that. But I think it touches the same point of culture and purpose and values. Would you agree, Blair?
It's hard. I mean, actually, it turns out, all the evidence shows that it's hard to be psychologically well off if you aren't centered, right? And the things that gives you a sense of center is, what do you value? What do you care about? Who really matters to you? And so if you take that to organizations, same thing. The other piece that's important in this, Debbie, is that people want to work for organizations that know who they are and they're proud of working for them because of who they are. Right? So if you don't get culture and you don't get the core traditions that you're going to retain, but make them modern, because they also want to work for a place that's cool and understands the world and is hip and is tech driven, right? But so somehow you have to put those two things together, and it feels paradoxical. So how do I be traditioned and be true to who I am, but actually be really cool and really relevant and really tech savvy in the 21st century? You can, by the way. Right? That's what makes it genuine. As soon as you give up that center, it's no longer genuine, and you don't come across as a valid leader anymore or a valid organization anymore.
Yeah. And to me, it's one of the most hidden, but maybe most important challenges when you look at employer branding, right? How do you make sure that people still feel connected with the organization?
Go ahead, finish your thought.
No, I was just wondering, because that's what I hear in a lot of conversations with clients, actually, that this has even been increased, the challenge of not losing your best talents, because basically you can work from everywhere for each company around the globe right now, and it's become even easier than it was in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue in this, because it's also true for customers, right? Which is, they want to know who a firm is in a very genuine sense. So what's the nature of the promise you're making? And they're gonna tick off some questions, which is, how are you relevant to a sustainable future? How are you a place that understands its people and takes care of them well? How are you a place that actually worries about the community I'm part of, right? So they're gonna have a set of criteria that are more expansive than we used to have for evaluating, are you someone I want to do business with? Do I want to give you money? Because even investors are asking those questions on you. Do I want to give you money? Do I want to buy your product? Do I want to work for you? And so if you don't answer those questions in a genuine way, but in a way that allows you to make money, this is another really important point, right? That it does no good to care about the world and fail tomorrow. It does no good to be a leader who's trying to make the world a better place and trying to fulfill a genuine purpose and actually not be successful in a role and be fired tomorrow. So we have to put together two things that may feel paradoxical, but actually they're not if we work it right, which is I'm here for a purpose and I'm here to make money. I'm here for a purpose and I'm here to succeed as a leader in an instrumental way. The good news is that the instrumentality today is really connected to the reason we're here in the first place, right? And so it feels contradictory, but if we work it right, it's not.
Yeah, great. It sounds like a lot leaders need to develop for the future, a lot that organizations need to develop their leaders on. And we see also from the survey that there will be an increase in leadership development. Looking at that landscape and listening to our discussion, people might feel like, okay, but what do we develop leaders on for the future? You know, it all sounds paradoxical, it all sounds ambiguous. So where do we put our money best when we look at leadership development?
So before we answer, can we put that back to you? I know you're the one doing the questioning, but can we put that back to you and hear your perspective? Because you've thought about this one a lot. Huh?
I did, yeah. Yeah, to me, actually, the best way to prepare leaders is to prepare them for a world they cannot prepare for, right? To be okay with what we discussed, be okay with not knowing everything, not being able to do everything, but be aware of your strengths and aware of your development areas and be strong enough to put people that are stronger in certain areas next to you, actually. And that's a mindset, and I see that with a lot of very hierarchical organizations especially, that step, that leap that leaders need to take in order to be able to develop them further. That should be the first focus in my mind.
So Anja, you just gave a better version of adapt and paradoxes than I've ever given. So let me play back what you just said, I think, right? Which is we live in a world that's ambiguous and we can't be sure what's going to come next, right? We just know it's going to come and it's going to come faster. Therefore, what we have to do is prepare ourselves to adapt. Mm-hmm. If we're going to prepare ourselves to adapt, you said two things, I think, both of which are right? One of them is you actually have to be capable of addressing all sides of the six paradoxes, which means you're going to have to surround yourself and engage with people who are very different from you and bring the team. Right? I think that's exactly right. So Debbie, what would you add to that?
I think courage is something that is very needed. If you look at what we've done, I think within PwC as well, right? We had the courage to say we're going to be net zero by 2030, something we don't exactly know how we're going to do it, but we know we need to do it. And then so sort of take that stand and then see how we're going to move there. And on the other side, which is paradoxical, but I think it goes very well hand in hand or needs to go hand in hand, is vulnerability. To be able to know, like exactly what you said, Anja, just know what your strengths are, know what your weaknesses are, and embrace people around you that are better at that. So I think having that courage and that power of vulnerability is essential.
You just did a wonderful version of Humble Hero, right? So because it says you have to have the humility to recognize what you're not good at and the vulnerability to be aware of it and work on it. But you have to have the courage to actually take decisions when it's a hard thing to do, right? And you have to have the courage to move when it's a hard thing to do. Those don't cohabit easily. So I guess, Anja, can I come back to you on this? The challenge with the paradoxes, they aren't by definition paradoxes. They just feel hard to do together, right? How do people navigate things that feel in tension? As you've been working with people, how do you help them think about that question? How do I be humble but know to be heroic? Because humility causes me to equivocate a lot of times or not take action. Heroism causes me to be proud and say, out of my way, I'm going to go do it. How do you put things together that just feel like they don't belong together easily in one person?
Well, two things I feel. One is staying close to our own values. So make sure that you're in line with what you truly believe in, with the organizational values that you live up to as a leader. And the other one is consult with other people, right? So speak about it when you do not know which side is the best to choose. And also be okay with the decision you took at that time, because at that time, it might have been the right decision. Not necessarily 2 days from now, but I guess do the best you can with the team around you, involving all their experiences, their views in your decision finding.
So this is where heroism is different, I'll take your last point, than it used to be. In some ways, we used to think of heroism as I take a decision, I persist, and I hit the wall. I'm Don Quixote, and I keep going to tilt the windmill, right? What you said is it's a more subtle version of heroism. You're courageous enough to take the decision, and you're courageous and you're able to explain the decision even though there's no obvious answer, but you're also humble enough to realize that it's going to require some changes in adaptation in real time, even if it doesn't lose the core idea of the decision. That's a different kind of notion of heroism than we're used to, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think actually it touches also the point of high integrity politician, right? Because you have to be true to yourself, true to your values and your norms in those of the organization, yet also a politic in being able to involve others, doing the right stakeholder management to bring others across, and also to admit sometimes maybe that you did something that might not be right in this case, but was right at the time. So you have to bring people along. So I think that concept comes in here as well.
Looking at perceived threats in the survey, we hear that CEOs are really worried about over-regulation in some of the markets. How do we see a traditional innovator coming into play here?
So I think we have to understand why that's occurring, right? And it's occurring largely for two reasons. The first is the world is fracturing. And so tensions between countries is growing. And so part of what's happening is that regions and nation states are creating regulation to support their own interests. And the EU is doing this a lot because actually it's the one thing they hold, right? So the US has the platforms, China has platforms, the EU has the ability to regulate. So you're seeing them as kind of the author of regulation for the world is what they're trying to be in a way. The second one is that actually there's a lot going on and people are trying to get their arms around it. Right. And so I think there are two things that are important in understanding that one. First is a globally minded localist. You've got to understand why the regulation is happening in your context, but realize what it means to be a global business in that world. And so you kind of have to be what we've used as a funny word, multinodal, Chinese in China, German in Germany, American in the US, but bring it all together in some way that gives coherence to the firm. That's a tougher leadership challenge than we've seen in a long, long time. Yeah. The second piece, though, is that you actually have to understand what you do that's really important to be able to adapt to the regulation. Because if you don't know the things that really matter, right? And so I'll give you an example. We kind of believe that we need a data lake. We're probably not going to have that. We're going to have a bunch of data ponds because countries are going to insist on data being held in the country. That feels core to who you are, but it probably isn't. It just is an assumption you made. So realize what's an assumption and what's essential, and protect what's essential in a regulated environment, but be willing to roll with the punches in all the other cases and be flexible.
Mm-hmm. So with that and with the perceived insecurity, instability, how do you execute strategy?
So I think this is an important point, which is execution is really important because things are going to come at you fast and you got to respond to them quickly and you got to adapt and you've got to do it really well. You've got to be exquisite in execution, but you've got to realize that in every decision you're taking and responding to that crazy world, you're setting up the future. So you've got to bring what you're trying to create, the future you're trying to have, into the immediate adaptation. So execution is no longer just execution, it's strategic execution. Strategy is no longer strategy, it's executional strategy. So think of strategy as a continuous journey and think of execution as creating the future. If you do those two things, we'll solve the world well.
Sounds easy. So when we summarize, we have that very paradoxical world around us. We have organizations facing different challenges on every level. There's threats mentioning in the surveys. So there's a lot going on. If you would give one advice out of everything that we discussed for each individual leader out there, and maybe for organizations, what would that be?
Debbie, you first.
Only pick one. I'd go for authenticity. I think it's very true what you said earlier, Anja, is staying true to yourself, daring to follow your intuition, which is usually very right, is something that will help you navigate those paradoxes. I would go for that. You, Blair?
So the thing I worry about in the conversation we just had is it feels hard, right? And the world is throwing stuff at us really fast. And so a danger is that you sort of say, this is overwhelming, I just don't know what to do, right? And what's striking to me is that the people who actually internalize the opportunities that are in front of us and accept the challenges and think about the paradoxes even reasonably well, actually, they have more fun and they're more hopeful, right? Because essentially what happens is they see a way out of something that feels really hard, right? I have to balance these things. And if I can balance these things, it'll work. And I have to keep this in mind. If I do, it will work. And so what I've seen is we've worked with people on developing as leaders in this way and dealing with the kinds of challenges that were described in the survey, is that actually they're having more fun. They smile more, they get a twinkle in their eye, and they just go for it. And then what happens is they become high integrity just because they're a better version of themselves. And then it becomes easier to do all these other things, right? So, and they bring people with them naturally. So the political part's easier because I want to be with someone who's having fun. I want to be with someone who has hope, and I want to be with someone who thinks it's doable. So all of this sounds pretty tough and pretty complicated. It really isn't, in a way. And actually, if you get it right, the world we're in is actually really, really cool. If you get it wrong, it's dark. It's incredibly dark. But if you get it right, it's really cool. And so let's get it right.
And maybe to add to that, maybe just, I think it's a very relieving starting point to think that you just can't get it right. Even the world becomes dark when you're taking the wrong decisions, as Blair just mentioned. But that's a nice starting point, right? To relieve that pressure from the executive leaders of the world, that there's no way of getting it 100% right in the future. It hasn't been there so much in the past, but now definitely no way. So just try to find the best way and try to find the best people around you that can support you. Okay.
I agree.
Thank you so much for that conversation. Very enriching. I think a lot that we can take away. I hope the listeners can take away for their own leadership, for their organizations. I'm very much looking forward to the next episode with you guys.
Thanks for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.